Okay, so let's look at a fairly contentious area. And it's an area of cybersecurity that at the one end we provide protection, we protect personally identifiable information, we can identify things, and we generally make things much more trustworthy. Encryption and cryptography can provide that foundation element to cybersecurity to make sure that data is protected at its core. On the other end, there is tensions around the usage of encryption, such as around the lack of general knowledge of how encryption actually works, how PKI works, how public key integrates into producing secure systems. And secondly, there is some tensions around the usage of end-to-end encryption and whether tunnels can be broken that would allow governments and law enforcement agencies to be able to identify threats to society. And finally, we'll look at the bluntest tool of all for a cyber criminal, and that's in the usage of ransomware, where the usage of encryption and cryptography have been turned on their head and now used against us. So let's look at the foundation around encryption. And it kind of all started around 1974 with Horst Fistel, who created the DES standard, which was then supported through IBM and became a standard within the finance industry. That then became 3DES and really started the move towards the usage of encryption to be able to protect financial transactions. But it's really in the late 70s, and especially the work of Whitfield Diffie and Diffie-Hellman in 1978 that really opened up the possibilities of key exchange and public key encryption. Up to that point, there really hadn't been methods that would allow Bob and Alice to communicate in an open way, and then for Eve not to spy on their communications. And while Whitfield Diffie produced the methods or outlined the methods that would be required for public key encryption, it was Rivest, Shamir and Alderman who came up with the solution with the RSA method, and which was the first public key encryption method that was usable. Then in 1982, Ralph Merkle produced amazing advancements in the areas of Merkle trees and also within public key encryption. Odi Shamir continued the work on from after the RSA algorithm to look at cryptanalysis and zero knowledge proofs. And then in 1992, the cypherpunks, including Timothy May, put forward an agenda which started to see a future which used public key encryption at its core. And it was Timothy May in 1992 who outlined that just as the technology of printing altered and reduced the power of medieval guilds and the social power structure, so will cryptologic methods fundamentally alter the nature of corporations and of government interference in economic transactions. Quite a bold statement, but really we can now see the potential of that statement. And at its core has probably been the move towards creating trustworthy infrastructures such as around blockchain or distributed ledgers. In the first version, we see old proof of work methods such as Bitcoin being used for cryptocurrency. But that was then enhanced on with the second generation using Ethereum, such as Ethereum using smart contracts and tokens and so on. And we could now start to build real applications based on these public blockchain infrastructures. But the third generation is now looking at instant consensus around things like Merkle, DAGs that allow for instant consensus and to be Byzantine fault tolerance. IOTA is a good example of this, and certainly as we move towards integrating IoT, we need to actually start to understand how we can create an instant consensus around the actual data within our infrastructure. And it was Merkel who proposed the Merkel tree in this very small patent here. Within that, he outlined a method that we could take our data and then we can have an overall hash for the data. And it was not possible to change anything within the data. We can prove that all the data elements existed through this root hash. And also through the root of the tree, we can prove different things. For him, we take a hash of 2 elements and then we hash them together and we'll get a root signature for the data within inside there. And it's this type of approach which is used as a core founding block of blockchain. So just as we look at the 7-layer model within networking through the ISO or the OSI model, so we could look at a future model for the future of our infrastructures or of our trusted ecosystems. And at the lowest layer we might see a cryptography layer, and that's to provide mathematical certainty at that lowest layer. But this cannot be enabled without a software engineering layer in between. So if we make sure that software engineering layer links with the cryptography layer, then we can build trustworthy systems which are usable. And then once we can integrate with that, we can start to look to see how we can build the infrastructure to make sure that we're building on that solid cryptography base. And for that, we integrate things like identities and roles and digital signing. So within our lab, we really look at building with a new toolkit. And that toolkit includes the usage of public key signing, zero knowledge proofs, a range proof. A range proof can prove that something is in a certain range without actually giving away the actual data value. Credential signing, aggregated signatures, Peterson commitments allow you to be able to commit data at a certain time and then reveal it at some later time. And a great move within inside our e-commerce infrastructure will be move towards tokenization, where we can define tokens for assets and trade them in the same way that we would normally trade our assets. And homomorphic encryption provides us the opportunity to encrypt values and then to still be able to mathematically operate on them, which means that the data processors could be open to a data breach, but the data would not be released because all of it would be encrypted. And then we have what's called ring and blind signatures used in cryptocurrencies to be able to anonymize the buyer and the seller of a transaction, but for it still to be trustworthy. And then there are stealth addresses that it's possible to be able to create addresses for transactions which only exist for a short time and cannot be traced to other addresses. A large area of development is likely to be in privacy preserving machine learning, and where we can operate machine learning on zero knowledge proofs and for homomorphic encryption, so that the data doesn't have to be released but machines can still learn. And then there are new systems such as the interplanetary file system, which allows a new way of creating a distributed web, not a centralized one as we have just now, but one which distributes the data across the world. Okay, so let's look at some of the basics of cryptography, and as part of that we look at Bob and Alice normally. So Bob and Alice are the key roles that Ron Rivest defined originally in his paper, but we also have other roles such as Eve, the eavesdropper, and Mallory, the adversary, malicious adversary. And with this we have Trent, and Trent is the entity which is trusted by both Bob and Alice to prove their identities in between. And then we have Peggy, who proves something, and Victor, who verifies it. So with these actors, we can actually tell stories around creating trustworthy infrastructures. So the most basic method of encryption that we have is obviously symmetric key encryption, and AES is the most common one here. Cha-Cha-20 is also a highly common method, especially promoted by Google. Within this we have what's called a stream cipher, which is fast and can actually perform its encryption and decryption in real time. But AES, although it's seen as a block cipher, can also be seen as a stream cipher if we use what's called GCM mode. And that converts our complicated block encryption methods into a stream cipher and makes it much, much faster. So with this we have a shared key between Bob and Alice. The same key encrypts as decrypts. And within this we might have a key exchange method where they can openly communicate even though Eve is listening, and they will end up with the same shared key. So that's the workhorse of the industry, and we typically look at 128-bit or 256-bit AES encryption. It's optimized for the whole process of encrypting and decrypting. Then we bring in public key encryption. So public key encryption is that Alice will produce a key pair, and Bob can use her public key to encrypt the data, and then Alice can use her private key to decrypt it. Where we mostly use this is where Alice will use her private key to sign the hash of a message, and then Bob will be able to prove that signing through the usage of Alice's public key. And in this way we can prove identity, we can also prove integrity of messages. The two main methods that we use at the current time are RSA and elliptic curve cryptography. RSA is hardly ever used now. We're generally moving towards elliptic curve cryptography, but for things like digital certificates, it's still mainly RSA methods that we use. To see the difference, we use 2000-bit keys often for RSA, where for elliptic curve we use 256-bit methods. So you can see that elliptic curve cryptography is much more lightweight, it tends to be faster, it scales better, and so on. And for things like IoT equipment, then really we need a method such as elliptic curve cryptography. And then we look at hashing methods, where we take a hash and it creates a fixed length fingerprint of the data. Typical methods here: SHA-1, SHA-256. They vary in the size of the data that's the hash that's produced. What's been found is that MD5 and SHA-1 are weak in both their methods and also for the length of the hash that they produce, 128 bits and 160 bits. And we need to move to SHA-256 and above to make sure that we don't have what are called collisions. Hash collisions are caused when we have two different types of data, two different data inputs, and we can produce the same hash signature. Within MD5 and SHA-1, that can be likely to be able to produce that, where with SHA-256 and above it's not really possible, it's not feasibly possible. Then we add what's called salt onto the hash. We take the message and we add some salt value and we produce a new hash which overcomes problems to do with rainbow tables. And then we might look at slow hashing methods such as bcrypt and PBKDFS2. These are very slow and can defeat GPUs in terms of their cracking. Okay, so that's the basic toolkit that we actually have. So now let's look at some of the areas that encryption is struggling with. And one area is that it tends to be a weak link. So it might be that we think that everything is working correctly, the software that we've created has been built correctly and it's using encryption and so on, it's been audited and so on, but the actual encryption itself might not be up to the best that it could be. So this is an example here where the CEO of Equifax was not sure if the company was encrypting their data. And also Dido Harding, who was the chief executive of TalkTalk, didn't actually know that their data was encrypted. So this is a worry because there may be a disconnect from the C-level executives to the actual implementation. And for companies which are dealing with sensitive information and finance information, encryption should almost be the standard thing, and it should be led by the C-level executives. And in this tweet here, we see that a company has decided that it's going to use weak security for passwords because usability is better. So there's a general lack of core understanding within the industry. One of the weak areas tends to be around software development and the integration of security. So in this case, this was a recent research paper in where developers were paid to encrypt a password or secure a password for a system. They were paid 2 levels of funds for the work, and the researchers looked at the result back again. The worrying element of this is that the top method that was selected for securing the password was MD5, and as we've seen, MD5 is as a weak hashing method and shouldn't really be used, 23%. 1 in 5 almost selected base64, which is not an encryption method and purely an encoding method. And the worry is that some people actually thought that it was chosen because it's tough to decrypt and encrypted so that the clear value is not visible. But base64 offers 0 security because it's an encoding method. These 2 methods here are a good choice. bcrypt and pbkdfs2 slow down the cracking process. This is a reasonable choice, but still not the best. And these are encryption methods, so they're fairly good. And unfortunately, this is also a weak method. So the worry is that really some software developers don't understand how to build secure applications. And it was identified that many of the developers had just copied and pasted standard code from the internet. The other worry around encryption and cryptography is the ghost in the machine. And the ghost in the machine is that how will law enforcement agencies and governments still be able to listen in on communications of the people that they do not trust? And one method that's proposed is the ghost in the machine, where there is a ghost contact added to a conversation. So we see what's called crypto wars, and with crypto wars, governments are requesting a backdoor in the communications that happen between entities. So if end-to-end encryption is used, then law enforcement agencies want some way to break the tunnel or break the method, which is extremely difficult, especially because any opening of that will open up tech companies to problems from cyber criminals. Along with this, there are problems around privacy of listening to these communications. So in Australia, for example, there has been some tension around law and the usage of encryption. And even in the UK, there has been debates around the usage of encrypted end-to-end communications. And of course the worry is that some companies, although they implement end-to-end encryption, there might be some way to be able to link data and metadata across different platforms. So for example, Facebook on Instagram and WhatsApp, and there might be a method where they can actually start to mine the data from different users with some form of miner, so that they can cross-fertilize into other applications. This would also allow for law enforcement agencies to be able to listen to the metadata that's involved. But probably one of the biggest weaknesses around cryptography just at the current time is in the usage of ransomware. And it's a threat that is increasing across the world, and the actual losses increase by the day. TravelX was brought to its knees by ransomware, and it never recovered. The NHS is obviously one example with WannaCry, and we were probably quite lucky that we got away with very little damage from WannaCry because someone was able to disable it. But the next time it could be a major attack, and it could cripple the whole of our healthcare infrastructure. Garment too was affected by it, and many other industries. So it's a crime that has a high chance of success and a low chance of being caught. So we see high ransom demands, average downtime around 16 days, potential data loss, potential loss of life in some cases, especially if we bring down critical national infrastructure, reputational losses and lawsuits, and a very, very low conviction rate of less than 0.707%. And it's a problem area across many different sectors, and we see here that healthcare, especially in the US, is a targeted area because it has probably a high chance of success, as opposed to something like the finance industry, which tends to have very good 24/7 security infrastructures. So government systems are often attacked, professional services, legal firms, and so on. And the overall cost is moving towards hundreds of billions of dollars per year. And it happened in Germany that there was a fatal case where ransomware infected 30 servers in a hospital, crashed the systems, which meant that patients were turned away, and it was thought that one person lost their life because of that. And there are many different mechanisms that ransomware can infect a system, many different ways in, and the most typical is often the spear phishing email with an attachment which installs the malware on the system, and then we have that route, the remote desktop connection. If remote desktops are kept open, the intruder can get in, and again it can lead to an exit from the network with encrypted data. Malicious links and so on, where the user is tricked into going to a malicious site or installing software with a backdoor in it. So there are multiple ways that ransomware can spread within can be sourced within a company. And then when it comes to actually paying the ransom, there's no guarantee that a company will get their data back again, even if they pay. 45% in this survey said they did, where 20% paid it and didn't get the data back. And only in this case, in this survey, 35% of companies said that they did not pay the ransom. So there's a great deal that's kept secret about the payments, but it's thought that the payments are generally increasing, and the chances of success are also increasing. So let's look at what the ransomware actually looks like and how it's actually how the ransomware is installed. Okay, so Eve tricks Bob to click on a spear phishing email. It downloads a ransomware program, and then it will go out and seek all of the target files on the system. It will avoid things like DLLs and EXEs and so on because it doesn't want to crash the system. It wants to keep it active so that Bob can still see how to pay the ransomware demand. So once we have the targets, we will most of the time use AES encryption because it's fast and efficient to encrypt the file. So we get a unique key and we get a salt value which is used with the key. So with those two things, the file is then encrypted. Then the encryption key that's used can be encrypted with Eve's public key here, and then GUID is added for the unique name of the computer, and then this key is sent back with the GUID to Eve. So Eve then takes her private key and can decrypt the key that's used. Bob must then contact Eve, and Eve will look up the GUID for the machine and then send the encryption key to be able to decrypt those systems. So you can see we're using public key encryption and also symmetric key, asymmetric and symmetric key here. What can be more common now is this type of method where the key is encrypted with inside the file with the GUID and with the salt. Then when the ransomware is running, we use Eve's public key and we encrypt the file encrypt the symmetric key within the whole encrypted blob that we create. So that's then encrypted and it has the encrypted symmetric key within itself. The only key that can now decrypt this or find the key is Eve's private key. So in this case, Bob can send samples of the ransomware to Eve. Eve just takes her private key and then decrypts this key here and can send the documents back again. So in this way, there doesn't have to be a communication back or a back connection to what's called the command and control, which is normally detected on a system. That doesn't have to happen, and everything can happen independently of Eve, and Eve just has to use her private key to be able to get the key that's been used to encrypt the file. So we often talk about a kill chain model within our attack systems. For ransomware, it's 8 steps roughly: gain access, gain privileges, generate an encryption key and the salt, identify the files of interest, perform the encryption, then create a denial to that critical data, protect the key and the salt in some way, and then maintain a functional payment channel. This shows a recent survey of the ransomware that was around, but this can vary greatly. But we can see that Phobos and Dharma and Revo are still popular ones here, and Abaddon. If we take out the main one there, then we can see Phobos and Dharma. Dharma are the top ones for the attacks, but you can see there are many different types there. And this shows a recent survey of all the recent attacks. Nearly 40% were caused through spam, 20% through corrupt web pages, about 8% through spear phishing, and 14% through vulnerabilities. And the one thing to notice here is that we can see generally there is a move towards no command and control here. At one time we had static domains so that we could find out the connection back and obviously block it, but then we've generally moved away from that with ransomware towards no command and control here. Generally also, we look at symmetric key encryption, but there are places where we're using public key encryption to be able to encrypt, and that becomes all the more difficult to be able to decrypt. But generally AES encryption is used for most of the encryption. For the infection method, we can see there are many different ways to do it. WannaCry was still spread by the Eternal Blue worm, and we can still see that that's still around and it's still a problem. But we see remote desktops, fake apps, spamming, plugin vulnerabilities, and so on. So there are many different ways to infect these things. And Windows isn't the only platform. We can see Linux and Android here as targets in there, and even Mac OS as a target. So we can see generally that there is many different families and methods, and it's very difficult to lock them down and to be able to detect all of them. So this shows some of the recent ones from there: GandCrab, Roku, and Locker, and so on. Not Petcha. Node command and control is AES encryption, and using Eternal Blue as the method to propagate through SMB for Windows. And in this case, it was highly profitable, and the creators of GandCrab retired because they had made 2 billion within just over a year for that. And this is a ransomware as a service infrastructure where there is payments and percentages of the returns are taken as a service cost. So how do we avoid it? Then, well, the obvious one is to stop people from clicking on malicious things. So education is the most important thing of all, to make sure that users can identify the threats and do not click on anything that looks malicious. Backups is obvious, and Trend Micro define 321, at least 3 copies of files on 2 different formats, and at least 1 copy which is off-site or offline somewhere. And this is why many of the banks cope quite well, because they have good backup strategies, especially in the cloud, where they can easily replace back or roll back systems through backups. A layered protection is important, and definitely to have different layers, different challenges as we go through the layers of protection. As we get nearer the data, then these challenges become tougher. A firewall is never really seen as a core protection against an adversary who can easily get behind it. Then there is network segmentation. We need to make sure that we segment and isolate all of our networks so that ransomware cannot propagate. And eventually also we create what's called a whitelist policy, and we make sure that only certain things run on the system, rather than going for a blacklist policy where we ban certain applications. Okay, so that's been a quick overview of encryption and cryptography. Either it's a savior for our industry and will generally improve things, make them more trustworthy, or it could be used to create bad things and allow cyber criminals to thrive. Thank you.